Welcome to Wanderback's first Wanderback Live of the year and our first in our four-part 101 education series about American single malt. I'm going to start with a cheers. Cheers to everybody out there watching right now.
Thanks.
We're delighted to have everybody here and be delighted to start this new year sharing our passion for American single malt, hopefully in a super fun way with everybody. But before we get into it, let me just tell you a little bit about Wanderback Whiskey. We are a boutique distillery located on our family farm in Hood River in beautiful Oregon. And our mission is to really explore the world of American single malts by creating annual limited edition expressions. And kind of our motto is, when they're gone, they're gone. And the way that we do this is a little different too. We have a unique production process where we make our bespoke grain bill in partnership and, in all honesty, in friendship with distilleries across the country. And then we bring that whiskey back home to Hood River, where we barrel age it, finish it, and hand bottle it. So we really hope that you like this new education series. Today's topic is World Whiskies Explored. We're going to be looking at Scotch, Bourbon, Rye, and single malt. And really in the next 30 to 40 minutes, the guys are going to explain the differences between these whiskey categories, share some favorites with you and why they love this type of whiskey, and really explore together some unique qualities. And then we'll touch a little bit on why Wanderback just digs American single malt and why we got into this. So without further ado, first of all, actually, if you are watching, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can just hit the button down there. And then today, talking and educating and having fun with you guys, we have Phil Downer. He is the founder and chief whiskey maker at Wanderback. Phil is also my lovely husband, and at Wanderback, I am called the boss of all other things. So I'm not really sure what that means, but and then with us today, we are delighted to welcome our friends from the That's Neat podcast. We have both Blake and Sean with us tonight. We're so thrilled that you could be here. The That's Neat podcast is one of our absolute favorite podcasts. They really dedicate themselves to whiskey, to the stories surrounding the whiskey and the people that they love to drink it with. And I highly recommend that you check them out on any of the podcast apps that you can access. Okay, so that's the intro. So without further ado, what we're going to do is dive into each of the whiskey categories, teach you a little bit about them, have some discussion, and then we'll meet back together at the end. So over to you, Phil, to talk about American single malt.
Thank you, Sash. Wanderback Whiskey, we focus on American single malt. We've had a number of releases now over the years. We basically, we'll talk about our model of how we do things, but basically when our releases are finished, they're finished, and they all share the common thread of being American single malts. But within that, there are variables that we play with that basically lead to some very distinct tastes. And but we make our whiskey with 100% malted barley, mainly pale malt, but also some specialty malts, yeast and water. It's mashed, fermented, and then distilled. We always use copper pot stills, which we can go into in more depth. We have done some things with finishing casks. We always start with new oak casks, which is different than Scotches and Irish whiskeys, which we're going to talk about. And then we finish in previously used bourbon. We've used port wine. We've used rum casks, and that leads to some pretty interesting tastes. I started thinking about American single malt when I tasted Stranahan's. I was in Boulder, Colorado, visiting friends, and I tasted Stranahan's, and I thought, "Holy moly, what is this?" And then I tasted St. George's, and I went on from there. But that's where it started for me. That's really what Stranahan's was. I believe we could say where it started in America with American single malt. And from there, it's just exploded. You know, we have so many places making amazing American single malt now in the U.S. So yeah, Blake and Sean, any questions or any things that I should touch on more? I don't want to spend too much time on any one topic, but what are your thoughts?
Well, maybe we could talk a little bit about where and when American single malt originated, and
Yeah.
about that. And I know, like, there's a point to be said that it's technically not a category quite yet,
Yes.
lawfully, but it's in the works. And there's the American single malt
Yeah.
community and the collective that is working on it. And
Yeah.
you're a part of that, aren't you, Phil?
Yeah, well, as a producer, we're part of the American Single Malt Commission that was started here by Steve Hawley and the guys at Westland. And but so I hate trying to say definitively when something starts. We're usually wrong when we try to say for certain what history was. But my take on the beginnings of American Single Malt was in Colorado with Stranahan's. This was started by a group, and I forget the name of the distiller, but it was an interesting story. It was a guy who was, I believe, a fireman who teamed up with a guy who was had some beer history. I don't know if he worked at a brewery or just was good at making good beer, homebrew. And they made whiskey with malted barley. It was, I believe, the mash was made across the street at a brewery to their specs, and then distilled in these funny looking pot stills. And they made amazing whiskey. It was for me, it blew my mind when I tasted this. I had always, I'm from Canada. I'd love Canadian whiskey, rye, Scotch, bourbons. But when I tasted this, it was really something special. And I think from there, I believe we would maybe say St. George's, but I don't know for sure. So, but I believe we can say that it was Stranahan's that was the first, if not one of the first, to begin this category.
Mm-hmm.
And sorry, go on.
I was going to say, I know that the folks at Clear Creek and McCarthy's were pretty new up there too. They were.
That's a very, very good point, because those guys are our neighbors and our good friends, and there's some really, really nice people there. And yes, that's right. And what they were trying to do is I believe what they were trying to do was to make a whiskey that was very similar to a Scotch in America.
Yep.
So there was the use of peated malt and previously used casks. And yeah, amazing whiskey again. So you're a very, very good point. That's in our backyard. That's Portland now in Hood River, the company. So. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I have a question too. What are you looking forward to doing with American Single Malts as part of Wanderback? Like, in terms of experimenting, and what are the possibilities?
That's a very good question. And I think it gets to the ethos of why I chose this category or this type of whiskey to focus on, because it's, when you compare it to other whiskey, and I'm biased because that's what we make and that's what I like, but, we have a huge breadth of choices to make when we make American Single Malt. And by that, I mean, when you look at using corn or wheat as a base for making, or rye for making a whiskey, those grains, wonderful grains, very, very nice, but compared to the malting of barley, they're not even close. You can, I mean, anybody who knows beer knows that the spectrum of tastes that you can experience drinking a beer are tremendous. And so we have the ability to take all of those grains, those specialty malts, and the pale malts as well, and as a starting point, you can go way so far, so many different tastes. You've got the peated malt, you've got the malts that have had a low amount of energy added to them, and then the ones that have had a greater amount of energy, and everything in between, and all of those various stages of heating and types of heating methods for those barleys, and then the barley grain itself. And then we haven't even talked about yeast or water or barrels or climates, So I think in answer to your question, I don't know where we will go with this, but I guarantee you there's going to be some big variations in what we release from one to the next. I mean, you look at the ones that we've released already, you compare batch 1 to batch 4, and then, Founders Reserve, and it's like you're not even tasting the same, and you're not even tasting the same whiskey. And those whiskeys started out identically, like the same grain, the same ratios of grain, the same yeast, the same water, the same stills, and the end result just crazy. So imagine what we get when we change those grains, or we use different water for those grains to ferment in, and then anyway. So like I said to you, if I run off at the mouth,
no, it's okay. It was really interesting. I was being fascinated. Do you think that the commission in a way kind of squashes the creativity?
Oh, well, yeah. So, I don't want to get into the politics of it all. I think, I think that what we're trying to do, what they're trying to do, Steve in particular are trying to do, is we're trying to do legit, and I'm speaking for him, I probably shouldn't, but we're trying to legitimize this category. We think that this is a really interesting category that the consumer should be made aware of. And so we're asking the TTB to do that for us. And, you can argue about how it should be defined, how tightly, how loosely it should be defined, definitely, but not my area of expertise. I think, but overriding all of this is we're trying to make it easy for the consumer to find us and to know that we're doing something different here. We're not making this whiskey with the same grains that you would make a bourbon or a rye with. And I think it's a good thing. I mean, clearly I'm biased, but I think it's a good thing, and I'm hoping they'll be successful, and the TTB will give us a nice, a definition that works for everybody, or for the most people at least.
Yeah, I think that's a great segue into our next category as well, which is rye whiskey. And a little bit about rye whiskey. American rye whiskey must be produced in, the United States, and be made up of at least 51% rye. It's a lot like bourbon in that way. And the other ingredients usually contain corn or barley and sometimes wheat, but it really can be any grain from rice to quinoa. Which is really fantastic in the way they can experiment that way. It's typically aged in new oak barrels, much like a bourbon. And it's fantastic. You get a specialty, like a special rye spice note that you usually get on a rye whiskey. And it's one of my favorite categories of whiskey. I have a few bottles here that I'd like to plug, if I may. I got I'm in reverse here. So I'm drinking right now the Texas rye whiskey from Balcones. Very fantastic pot stilled whiskey. It's very rich and dense and oily that you would expect from a pot still whiskey, but you also get those florally kind of delicate and spicy notes from a rye that kind of dance around your tongue, which is fantastic. And I also have few bourbon or a few rye whiskey, which is really great. And this one in particular, it's still considered a rye, but what they did is instead of proofing down with water, they proofed it down with a tea, which is really interesting. So this is their Immortal rye whiskey. And I also have their regular straight rye here. Now, something about straight rye whiskey is it has a little bit more regulations on it. It has to be aged at least 2 years, be aged in new American oak, and be made and no food, no coloring or no flavoring added. So a straight rye whiskey has a little bit more regulations to it, kind of like a bourbon does. Did you guys have any questions or anything about rye whiskey?
Blake, could you talk a bit about the differences between a Canadian rye, because that's kind of what they're known for, versus an American rye, which they're also known for that too. But of course, you think American bourbon first before rye.
Yeah, so a Canadian rye, I did a little research, and maybe Phil could correct me if I'm wrong, since he is from the great land of Canada.
Same.
But oh yeah, that's right. But actually, a Canadian rye whiskey is kind of hand in hand with Canadian whiskey. So you could go into a bar in Canada, and if you ask for a Canadian whiskey, they'll give you either a Canadian straight whiskey or a rye whiskey or just a whiskey in general, because it's kind of they're kind of the same thing there. In fact, a rye whiskey in Canada doesn't have to contain rye at all. It just has to contain the same flavor profile that other Canadian whiskeys have.
Oh, interesting.
It can be made of any cereal grain or grain products. Must be aged in small wood for at least 3 years. Mashed and distilled and aged in Canada. And a bottle of it can't be less than 40%. I think that's about all I know. It can actually contain caramel coloring or food coloring. It has to be a natural food coloring, and it can have flavoring in it as well. But the flavoring has to be they have to be an aged spirit from wood, and it has to be, or a wine. So it's a natural spirit that they're using as a flavoring spirit. So yeah.
Yeah, and a lot of the great ryes come from Western Canada, Alberta distillers, and a lot of the grain that's grown in Western Canada is rye, is wheat obviously too, but so it's made with the grains that are most accessible, and so but there's some amazing ryes. Crown Royal is one of my favorite whiskeys all time, and so. It's been the beginning. It's also been used as the beginnings of some of the very well-known American ryes. Whistle Pig was made and still is most of what they release, I believe, although they've been making their own now for a few years. But their whiskey started as the products of Canada, Canadian whiskey. They were Alberta distillers, I believe. And so some amazing, tasty whiskeys. So were you going to talk about American ryes, some American ryes, or should we move on to Scotch, or what?
I think that's a good segue into Scotch.
Okay.
If you want to take it off, Sean.
Yeah, I would love to. Welcome to my favorite type of whiskey, Scotch. As you might have guessed, you can't actually make it a Scotch and not have it made in Scotland. It must be made in Scotland. And it's usually produced from malted barleys, which other grains and cereals can be added into it. And then it's also aged in casks of no greater than 700 liters, and it's bottled at no less than 40% alcohol by volume. So it's a pretty regulated whiskey. It's pretty strict. You can't go around and have copycat scotches, because they hold it near and dear to their heart over in Scotland. But yeah, another thing I might add to that is it has to also be aged at least 3 years in Scotland, and the distillery was mashed in. So very, very lots of rules, but those rules are good because they make some
tons of rules. It's been around for a very, very long time, obviously, and typically when something's been around for a long time, there's a lot of rules around it. They're very proud of their Scotch, and they don't want it to become, I guess, something different. So
definitely, you want to keep it consistent. When people have a Scotch, they want to know what it is. Before I show what I am, so I brought 3 bottles. Before I show what my first one is, I kind of want to quickly highlight Scotland's very famous for its regions of Scotch. So you have kind of 6 main categories. I think about 5, maybe only 4 of them are really the official ones, and you kind of have like 2 outliers. So you have Islay, you have Highlands, you have Speyside, you've got the Islands, you've got Lowlands, you've got Campbelltown. So 6 various different regions. I'll get into a little bit about what kind of flavors you expect from those regions. But the first bottle I have on, which is what I'm actually drinking right now, it's one of my all-time favorites, Lefroy 10. So this is like one of the flagship, what you'd
Fantastic.
Never heard of it. Never heard of it. Where's
what is this thing? Exactly. So when you drink Lefroy, this is like what you think of as Islay. It's smoky, it's peaty. you get seaweed, you get brininess. It's I use this term a lot in our podcast. It's like you're drinking in a lighthouse, and this is what you expect to be drinking in that lighthouse on a stormy night is Lafroig. So definitely go to. I use this Scotch as a way to to test people's metal. If they can handle Lafroig, they can handle just about anything, because it is
it gets
senses.
Gets very easy after that.
It really does. As soon as you're used to it, it's very good.
It's a good way to. I always say it's a good way to weed out our friends. So.
I made the mistake of being like, I don't like smoky things. I was like, here's Lafroig. See if you can handle this. Like almost as a prank. And they got pretty mad at me. But anyway, but when people think of Scotch, they always think it's just a campfire in the mouth, like kind of feel, which is what they use a lot when they're thinking of Lafroig or Lagavulin or the other really Ardbeg. Some of the Ardbegs are very smoky too. But I like to bring other stuff too. So one of the other ones I have is from the Highlands. So this is Macallan 12. Very good Scotch. Slightly controversial though, because it is from the Highlands, but some people think the flavor profile fits more with the Speyside, which is kind of almost a region within the Highlands of Scotch. Because like Highlands, you get typical, almost like fruit cake, malt, oaky, heather, dried fruit type of flavoring to it. But this one almost has sometimes a bit of a butterscotch, maybe a bit of a cherry. So it's a bit sweeter, even for a Highland, which is already sweeter than an Islay, typically. Again, with all these regions, there's always caveats. There's always, exceptions to the rule. Like, yes, you can go to Speyside and still have a very smoky Scotch. They do have those there. But I want to bring this one on as a...
Do you know why that's one of my favorite Scotches in the world? Do you know why that is a good one for you to like, speaking to or about Wanderback here today, Sean?
You have to fill me in.
So one of the malts that we use in our whiskey, the specialty malts, is pale chocolate malt.
Ooh,
and
really?
that's also a malt that's used in the Macallan, I believe. I don't know what percentage, but it is one that's used. And so that is a very, very strong malt, specialty malt. I don't know if you've ever seen it. It's almost black. It's what's used to make stouts and some brown ales as well. But it has a very distinct taste. It also, because it is heated so much, it's burnt basically. So there are some phenols that are compounds that are created there. And so when people try our whiskey, especially some of the earlier releases, batch 1, I think in particular, people comment there is a smoke, and we don't use peated malt, the traditional Scotch malt that gives it that, like Lafroig is made with heavy peated malt. We don't use any peated malts in our whiskey, but we use pale chocolate malt, and pale chocolate malt is very, very highly heated. And so, that's why.
That's cool.
In fact, I didn't know you were going to pick that one out, but the Macallan,
it's one of my favorites.
It's really, really nice.
Yeah, so it's definitely one of the ones that like I use as an alternative when people are like, I don't like a smoky campfire. It's like, here, let me turn you on to the Macallan. It's got slightly citrusy notes, a bit more fruity notes. But my third and final bottle I brought today is one of my other favorites, and this is a proper Speyside. Whereas the other is kind of like, is it a Highland or is it a Speyside? There's some debate about it. But this one is pure, good Speyside, Balvenie 12, double wood. Delicious stuff. So this is also one of the ones I share with people if they want a different type of experience. It's sweeter. It's got that Oloroso sherry influence going on with it. So if you like anything sherry, definitely give this one a try. It's very good. It's still got that hint of little bit of peatiness, not a lot though. This one's probably the least smoky of the ones I brought today for sure. So It's a very different experience, and I definitely give this to people that want something else when they think Scotch is only one thing. Like, no, Scotch is a lot of things. That's what's so exciting. Speyside's a bit more like butterscotchy, a bit more caramel, a bit more dried fruit, almost like cherries, that type of sweetness going on. So it's different than Highland, but similar in terms that it's a sweet alternative to Islay whiskeys. So definitely, if you want to get into Scotch, try these 3 different bottles, and I'll give you a wide example of what Scotch is capable of.
Good spectrum for sure.
Definitely.
Yeah, that was great, man.
Yeah. So, and then when it comes to Scotch, I thought we'd talk a little bit about peat. What do you guys think about getting that vehicle of peat with the smoke into the bottle?
Oh, I love it. I'm a huge peat head, so I'm a little biased, but I think we've been talking about changing the podcast name to That's Pete for quite a while. So we love Pete over here.
It's funny, but Pete is a Pete is a taste that, well, first of all, for most people, especially people who are not used to whiskey, it's not a very easy. It's not the one that it's not the taste of whiskey you want to slam people with. The first off, it's it's an acquired taste. It's something that, like a strong coffee or a really deep dark red wine, it's not easy. But living in the Northwest, I don't know how many of our listeners are not in the Northwest, but where we live, like right now, it's cold and rainy, and those kinds of phenols, those smoky tastes are really comforting on a night like tonight. And so it fits, if you live in California or somewhere where it's hot all the time, Arizona, you're probably not going to really, well, I shouldn't say that because mezcals are smoky too. And people love mezcals in the hot climates, obviously. So I shouldn't say that, but phenols, the smokies, the peaty smells, the peaty tastes are wonderful tastes. And the thing about it is too, we lump it all together as peated. But if you took a Laphroaig or Lagavulin or some of those other lighter peated whiskeys, the smokes are different. And
I was about to say that, Phil.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. Just within that, just like sweetness can be different, smoke can be different, and
you get a saltiness from the seaside type of peat. But then other places, you got decomposing trees at all, you get that type of peat going on too.
Yes,
and
that's right.
For our podcast, we recently just tried Copperbacks. Washington Copperbacks. Goodbye, Coppers. I'm not even finished yet. I'm already slurring my words before I get strong. But but Copperworks has a Washington peated whiskey is, and that one has like flavors of cedar, pine, evergreen. Right. It feels like you're in the Washington forest. Versus when you drink this, you get transported to Scotland, which is what you want with a Scotch. So
but smoke is something that people should try to appreciate. But I would advise you start off with the light smoke and build your way up, because if you slam yourself with a Laphroaig first off, you're probably not going to have a good drink. I don't think you'll enjoy it as much
unless you're made of sterner stuff. Before we move on from Scotch, I just want to quickly go over the next category about second use filling for aging. What do you guys like about second fills on Scotches?
I like. Well, it's a really. If you think about American whiskey, the barrel is, 80, 90% of its flavor. And when you think about a Scotch and they're using a second fill, it's using a barrel that's already been used before. And so it's not drawing a whole lot of flavor out from the barrel. It still does, but it's relying a lot more on that raw ingredient, the raw malt. And it takes a lot longer. That's why you see excuse me. That's why you see a lot of 15, 18, 20-year-old Scotches, and they're still pretty and light and great. Yeah. I love it.
It is good. I don't know. I would agree with you that when you're dealing with bourbons and ryes to a degree, but particularly when you're making a whiskey out of corn primarily, you rely quite heavily on the barrel. It's super important. For taste and amazing, wonderful. We use at Wanderback, we use new oak, but we have a lot of respect for the new oak. I mean, we have a ton of really amazing oak trees in the U.S. and access to some incredible barrels. The cooperages that we have here are pretty phenomenal. And so we appreciate the amazing flavors you can extract from a new cask using it for the first time. But we stop short of it overpowering the grains and the yeast and so on. So what we're trying to do, and I'm not trying to toot, well, I am trying to toot should I toot our own horn? I'm not sure.
I'll do it. I think you should, absolutely.
All right.
You got it.
What we're trying to do is avoid the over oaking of our whiskey. And so we, when we start to get around 2.5 years in a new oak cask, we take it out, then we put it in other previously used casks. So casks that we've used before, that have had whiskey in it before, ex-bourbon casks, wonderful bourbon casks from some of the big Southern distilleries for bourbon. We've used, and then port and rum and various other things. So they all have a role. But I think, what we're trying to do is give a chance for the new oak to do its thing, but not have it overpower everything else.
That's why I like what you guys are doing with your different releases, your different batches, because you can kind of almost have like this American mentality of how to make whiskey, but then also Scotch mentality. Yeah. So you kind of do best of both worlds, which is awesome.
I know, and I hope we can continue to do it because it's so amazing. Like I could go on about casks forever. I find that, yes, and I won't, because I'm trying to ignore my wife's putting comments over here on the right, but I'm ignoring them on purpose. We have access to some incredible barrels, new and old, and not only is it about the extraction of flavors that you get to play with, but the effect of oxygen. These casks are amazing. They're waterproof, yet they allow oxygen to pass through. And so that oxidation, and I'm going to go on for too long here, I'm sure, but we put our whiskey in a very neutral cask sometimes when we just want taste to mellow and meld and become just amazing. I've seen some things happen in casks that were really quite nice, and in a cask that really had very little, if any, taste to add.
Yeah, and I think that's a great segue. Speaking of new American oak into bourbon, because without it, you really wouldn't have the category bourbon. The new American oak really does provide, I would say, 80 to 90% of that flavor, and it must be produced in the United States. Can't exceed 80% alcohol by volume. That's off the still, so it must be stilled at 160 proof. Produced from fermented mash that is no less than 51% corn. So much like rye, which was 51% rye, corn bourbon must be 51% corn, which the rest can be a lot like rye. It can be it can be rye. There can be, a lot of the bourbons are 51 or 70% corn and the rest rye. So you get a lot of high rye bourbons out there as well to kind of give that spicy note. And must be stored in a new American oak container, which we talked about, and can't be entered into that container at more than 125 proof. Now, I have a few bourbons that I really love. This one here.
Nice. How did you find out about that one? How did you find out? That's very interesting. You like that one. I do too. How did you find out about that?
Oh, well, our podcast co-host Marcus is a Texas whiskey aficionado and got me hooked on almost all things Texas whiskey. And I love Iron Root. They're corn whiskey. Their bourbons, all very, very good. Now this is their cask strength. Sorry, everything's in reverse for me. Their cask strength Harbinger, which is a 115 proof bourbon whiskey. Absolutely amazing. The first time I tried this whiskey, I thought it might have been finished in a port barrel or something in sherry, because it was so dense and fruity, and the proof, like, it doesn't even hit you. It's just it carries all those oils and the density of that whiskey, which is just amazing. And I can't recommend this whiskey enough. You should be able to find it at most Total Wines up here in the Pacific Northwest now. I think it won Bourbon of the Year last year as well, which is pretty good for them. Another fantastic bourbon is another Balcones bourbon I have here, Texas whiskey. This one, a lot like the Iron Root, very, very dense, very oily. And this one's not at cask strength. It's at about 46% alcohol. But you get a lot of those dried fruits, stone fruit, cherry, very dense vanilla oils. It's almost like a vanilla extract. It's so dense in the flavors. And I can't not show off a little bit of Woodinville since I'm up here in up here in Seattle.
Represent. That's good stuff.
Yeah, this is one of my favorites. This was their bottled and bond release, so I could talk a little bit about bottled and bond. It's a lot like straight or just bourbon, where there's a little bit more rules. Bottled and bond must be aged in a federally bonded warehouse, so it's under the watch of a federal agent, basically, and must be bottled at 100 proof, and it has to be over 4 years old, and then all the rest of the bourbon rules. So no coloring, no flavoring, new American oak, such like that. So yeah, that's bourbon for you. Did you guys have any questions about bourbon or anything I could answer for you?
Well, I want to comment. All bourbons that you presented there were made with using pot stills. Most of the bourbons that we know of, the big bourbons that most of us are aware of, are made using column stills. And so, yeah, pot stills do some very nice things. And those ones you just brought up are great, really, really good. Yeah, but pot still, I mean, I love a pot still. I love what comes out of a pot still. It really makes a different whiskey. And we make our whiskey only with pot stills, and there's a reason. Like you just highlighted with the bourbons that you just brought out. It's a good way to make whiskey.
Yeah, you could kind of see that I'm a little partial to pot still whiskey, but there is benefit to column as well, depending on what you want. If you want a lighter whiskey or a cleaner whiskey, a lot of people cleaner.
That's right.
They'll they can, with different levels of a column still, it can take out different aspects of that distillate. So yeah. You can get a cleaner distillate off a column still, but not a lot of people want that. A lot of people want a lot of the tails and a lot of the heads, and to get the most out of the malt that they can get.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, when you have that big column where you can extract things off wherever you at many different levels, like you say, you can be much more precise with your cuts. And whereas a pot still, you're getting more of the fusel oils coming over, depending on where you make your cuts. Things they're evaporating, condensing back and forth, and it's just a different way of creating taste, interesting taste. And yeah, I'm partial to the pot still as well.
For people that are trying to get into different whiskeys and then trying to figure out what the difference really is, what do you think changes when you're using corn instead of Scotch? We're using malted barley, things like that. What is
I think definitely corn is a more neutral type of grain. You're not going to get a whole lot of that maltiness that you get from a malted barley. Mm-hmm. Corn, you're going to get a lot more sweetness, and then that impact that you're going to get when it's put into a barrel is pretty big. It kind of exaggerates that sweetness and the vanilla notes that you're going to get, and kind of almost hard candy notes that you can start getting out of corn distillate. So if you're starting to get into whiskey and you're trying to get into a bourbon, and if you like sweet flavor profiles, I would say bourbon is a great way to go.
I think a lot of people should actually compare what they're already drinking if they're starting out, because a lot of scotches you have use ex-bourbon cask, so you get that vanilla note in there, that sweeter note that's usually coming from a bourbon. So if you're trying something different, you want to get more flavor profiles, go straight to bourbon, and there's a whole new world of whiskey.
Yeah.
I mean, I think about, the Scotches, the Irish, the American single malts, these are made with malted barley. And if people want to get a sense for what those tastes are, you can buy malt at beer stores, all different kinds of malts, and just grind them up and put them in hot water and smell them and taste them, make a tea, and that's a nice way to get a sense for what tastes are there. Mm-hmm. And then corn, I mean, flakes of dried corn, polenta, cornbread, these are the things these are corn type tastes. And then wheat, you can do the same thing, make a tea. Well, wheat, we eat wheat all with bread and pancakes and whatever. Mm-hmm. And rye, same thing, you can make a tea. So it's a nice way to sort of get a sense for some of those tastes that we're creating by using these different grains. And when I think about barrels create both sweet and spice. You get a lot of astringency, particularly from a more toasted wood. But you also get the vanillins are also wood extracts. There are sugars as well that come from wood. So when I think about things, I do think sweet and spice. I think about complementary tastes, particularly for those people who like to cook. You want to balance tastes, and so sweet goes well with spice and so on. So anyways, that's the way that I kind of think about it when I'm thinking about whiskey and the bases of various tastes.
Yeah, bourbon is great, and I feel like right now we're kind of seeing a resurgence in how bourbon is kind of, maybe it was the American single malt crew that kind of influenced them, but we're seeing a lot of finished bourbons.
Yeah,
we're seeing a lot of bourbons, pot still bourbons, and things like that, which is great. Which kind of brings us back to American single malt. And yeah, maybe we could kind of discuss the similarities there, or the influences that it might have had.
Well, I mean, bourbon is the basis of whiskey, I think, in the U.S. I think we would all agree on that. That's where rye is where it really started, but then bourbon has been the more popular over the past number of decades. Yeah, I mean, bourbons are amazing. I never saw, well, there are some big depths or different tasting bourbons obviously on the market. But one of the issues that I see with bourbon, and the reason that I didn't choose to make bourbon, was the limitations of corn. I mean, there are different types of corn: blue corn, yellow corn, and there are things. I wouldn't say that corn is a one-dimensional taste variable, but it's not. You are limited to a certain degree with wonderful sweetness, amazing pleasant oiliness as well. But there are limitations. Then when you compare that to what we're doing in the American single malt category, or what we have access to, like I said, many different types of malts. Malts, just endless. The pale malts, there are different tastes within the pale malts. These are the less heated malts. And then you have the specialty malts, which have been heated, some of them to a great degree, like the pale chocolate malt that we use. And the depth of flavors, I should say the breadth of flavors, is amazing. It's just, it's endless. And so that for us gives us a palate that is pretty nice to work with, pretty endless to work with. And then then we're not even talking about yeast or water or barrels, So that's kind of why we did this.
Yeah, I love it. A friend of mine once told me that American single malt whiskey is kind of like a 5-way freeway, with exits kind of going off in all sorts of directions, whereas a bourbon is kind of like this 2-lane highway that going through the mountains. It can take some nice turns and twists, but it's always kind of on the same road. So I think that's a huge advantage that American single malt has. I wouldn't say it's a disadvantage for bourbon, but
bourbons are wonderful. Yeah,
definitely. But I love the variance and exploration that American single malts can take. And I think with that, I think it's a great wrapping up point, and we could kind of get back to Sasha here, and she can.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to just say thank you so much, you guys. That was really cool. Blake, I love that analogy between American single malt and bourbon. I'm going to use that one in future.
We probably shouldn't. We're going to get in trouble for bashing bourbon, and we don't want to do that. We all love bourbon.
Kentucky will come after us.
Ours is the best, but the other ones are great too.
Nobody said that a 2-lane highway was bad.
No, sometimes people like the view and the long route.
But anyway, Sean, thank you so much. Blake, thank you so much. Phil, thank you so much. Thank you to everyone for listening. We hope you learned something. We hope you had fun. Just another reminder to subscribe to our YouTube and to check out the That's Neat podcast. And we hope to see you back here in a couple of Wednesdays' time, where we'll be tackling our next topic, which is going to be all about pale and specialty malt, the production methods and the impact that they have on the flavor of American single malt. So we really look forward to seeing you then. Have a wonderful Wednesday, and cheers to you guys. Thank you.
Thanks so much.